Well, I am really excited about this panel because it's three CEOs who have built what I would argue are the most important new media businesses of the last 6 years. We have Bari Weiss, founder of Common Sense, who is building what I would call the alternative Atlantic in terms of the voices she's curating and the daily newsletter she's putting out and her podcast. We have VandeHei, who many of you all know, basically recreated political news. I knew that when I was at the Washington Post, and I think many of the people in this room knew that. And then finally, we have Chris Best, the founder of Substack, who is creating the platform for the new op-ed page, and not only the new op-ed page, for independent voices and independent journalists to be able to bring their voices directly to an audience. And what's really interesting about this, and I think we're going to welcome them on stage in a minute now that the set is here, but what's really interesting about this is 6 years ago, when these companies were founded, venture capital and many, many people did not believe in new media. There was a meme that was basically like, you cannot create a new media company. New York Times and the Washington Post were suffering. It's part of the reason why I left the Washington Post. And when you look around at what's happened, I mean, it's completely transformed the media ecosystem. So now we have three guests who are going to join us, who I think will be able to explain what's happening in media, especially at a week like this week where it feels like every news story has just been exploding, including elections. But I think we'll have a great conversation about how new media has transformed. So thank you so much for joining us. So Jim, I want to start with you because you started Axios 6 years ago, and it was a time where I think a lot of people doubted that new media could actually grow. It was like the Washington Post had sort of just been bailed out by Jeff Bezos in 2014. Yep. I'd love to hear how you had conviction that actually your readers in Washington, but also readers across the country, would pay for news.
Well, one, we don't make them pay for news. It's free, but we do a lot of advertising around it. But the premise of your question is right. Like, if you look at the history of the internet, there's only arguably 4 or 5 successful media companies that have either sold or have gotten to a place of durable profitability. So it's a really hard space. I was a terrible person raising money initially because I was always honest about that. I was like, if you're a venture guy or woman and you're trying to get a 10x, get the hell out of media, go to healthcare or go to energy or technology places that you're much more likely to get that kind of return. But what I felt with us is we had done it before with Politico. We knew this space. We know the DC space in particular, which is very much driven by companies that want to be able to have their advertisement in front of people who are in positions of power in technology, business, media, and politics. And so we knew if we could hire the right mix of reporters that could grab the attention of those type of readers, there's a really good business that follows from there. And one of the upsides of media is that it's one of the easiest and most cost-effective way to build a brand that has real meaning and real resonance with a big swath of people. Once you have that brand, then you got to figure out what do you do? How do you monetize it other than advertising? So now we have, high-end subscriptions for professional services. We created a communications company to teach companies to communicate more effectively and efficiently, and luckily that combination worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Bari, I want to ask you because I think there was an assumption that if these new media companies are flourishing, then that's at the expense of the New York Times, the Washington Post, companies that are legacy media. But they've had pretty good last 5 years as well. I'm curious how you would think about, it feels like in some ways the dominant narrative or the mainstream media is doing quite well, but also alternative media and new media companies are doing great as well too.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think that's a reflection of our culture and our politics, which is there is an audience, a very big audience. My mom and my grandma are among that audience for what Rachel Maddow does and what the New York Times does every day. But I think there's a growing audience of people who used to read the New York Times every morning or listen to NPR in their car. And now they're saying, I don't really trust what I'm hearing in those places. Where can I go? And that's frankly where companies like Axios come in, where platforms like Substack come in. Those people are desperately searching for an alternative. And I think maybe what's been underestimated is just how intense the hunger is for that alternative, which is why so many of these new places are flourishing.
Yeah. Now, and Chris, you started, I believe you started Substack in 2017. Why did you, you were sort of a media outsider. Your first company was not in journalism or media. What gave you conviction that actually, we should build a media platform to allow for independent voices to flourish?
I think it might have been because I was one of those people as a reader who was seeing the shift, the consolidation into a few big organizations that felt sometimes like they'd been taken over by pod people. And on the other end, the sort of social media universe covering like this Cambrian explosion of citizen journalism and news, but where the incentive system seemed to create sort of a pull towards madness. And I often just felt as a reader, as somebody who was trying to understand the culture I was living in, like I was taking crazy pills. Like this was something I wanted, I needed in my life to make sense of the world. And my co-founder Hamish, who's a writer himself, felt that same missing thing in the world from the writer's side, from this place of, can I strike out on my own? Can I make something independent and do the work that I believe in and actually make money from it? And those two things sort of came together to become Substack.
Yeah. And the other thing that sort of changed around the same time where you started Axios and Substack was we saw the President of the United States going direct on Twitter. So using a technology platform to bypass media. Jim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if you're a reporter in a newsroom and you've covered politics, you've covered Washington in the standard way for a very long time, and then you have that sort of change where now you have AOC and people going completely direct to their audience on live streams on TikTok and Instagram. How does that change the job of being a journalist?
I don't know that it changed the job of being a journalist that much. I think Twitter, in an unhealthy way, captivated the attention of too many reporters and created a lot of groupthink. I think the reporters would rationalize it by saying, well, I'm using this feed of information that I'm getting through Twitter to help connect with news sources or connect with new information. My personal view on Twitter, in terms of its effect on journalism, is I think it ruined a lot of mainstream journalism, because a lot of the habits that people thought and suspected about reporters in terms of their bias and their ideology, they were hidden until Twitter came along. And there was something about being able to tweet and share, and suddenly now they're exposing what team they're on. And so now you had 40 to 50% of the country going, told you. Yeah. And then they're validating it with their behavior each and every day. And then I think that even loosened them up when they got on cable TV. And so you ended up in this situation, partly because of Trump, partly because of Twitter, partly because of our species, where you had a lot of people who just no longer trusted the work that we're doing. And I think the one thing that unites all of us is, like, we care in truth, we care about information, and we want people to believe the things that happen to be true. And when that goes away, that's bad for us, it's bad for the country.
Yeah. But we're living in just such a strange split screen reality right now for those of us who are interested in truth and interested in upholding the best of old school journalistic traditions without, frankly, the bullshit politics that accompanies so much of it right now. If you look, I'm obsessed with the FTX story, obviously, as I imagine everyone in this room is, right? And you have this strange situation where you have this 2,000-word profile in the New York Times that doesn't mention the $400 million that he donated to Democratic candidates, that doesn't mention, Madoff, Enron, like the kind of things that he's being compared to. And then you go on Twitter, and Chris and I were talking about this backstage, and you have a non-Twitter account called Autism Capital breaking all of this news about this story. You have another guy, I forget his name, I'm sure people in this room are following this obsessively, who's been on Twitter Spaces, like I'm sure he's hyped up on Adderall, for 10 days in a row with like Anthony Scaramucci and then Elon Musk in a dark room with a candle. And it's like, it's amazing on the one hand that this kind of citizen journalism is happening. On the other hand, that is not a substitute for the kind of work that is being done every day at places like Axios. Like, you do need the fact check. You do need, 2 sources, 3 sources, and so it's just a strange world we're living in where, on the one hand, you have this sort of like Borg-like groupthink quality from a lot of the legacy media places, and it's distrusted for that reason. And then you have this kind of like Wild West situation that often stumbles onto truth and often stumbles onto it before those legacy places, but doesn't have the rigor and certainly doesn't have the distribution. And so I'm really curious, like 10 years from now, what that Wild West space will come to look like.
Totally. And that's a good question for all of you, because you have different business models, obviously different audiences, but the trust point that you pointed out, this is a real problem. It's like, when the newsroom gossip actually ended up on Twitter, that's when Americans woke up and said, oh, wow, these are people with biases and with thoughts and views on politics. How do you build trust in this? Twitter's not going away. These new platforms aren't going away. People are now getting used to the fact that biases are out in the open. How do you run a newsroom? How do you run a platform in a world where you have to continually build trust with your audience?
I think we're all experimenting with different versions of that, right? Like, one of the reasons you don't use advertising, right? Is that you want to be able to build this bond of trust between reader and audience. For us, we're experimenting with, we don't have an opinion page. We ask our reporters to stay off of Twitter and social media platforms expressing their personal opinions. And then the other place where we're putting a lot of investment is in getting as close to your office or as close to the city you live in by expanding in local and expanding in professional services, because those are two of the last places where you can create a relationship of trust. Because if I'm writing about your community, you can look out the window and tell if I'm full of shit. If I'm writing about your profession, either you're going to use that information to get a professional edge or you're not. Whereas these national topics are just so easy to manipulate, to twist, to throw into these different sort of tribal ecosystems and kind of pollute. But I think all of us are experimenting with it. And I'm kind of with Bari. I don't know where this ends up 5 or 10 years from now. I kind of like the trajectory that we're on. I feel like little by little we're cleaning up some of the stuff. Some rules of the road are going to be set. You have new entrants that are producing serious journalism, new vehicles for people who have a serious voice and might want to get the hell out of the big institutions and try it on their own. So I like the things that are happening. I just don't know where it ends.
And there's no silver bullet yet. Like, you can be captive to your advertisers, you can be captive to your audience. Like, there's clear pitfalls in both directions. I know for myself, I've watched sort of these cautionary tales again and again of individual creators going out on their own, finding a huge audience, making a lot of money, and then continuing to feed that audience stronger and stronger black tar heroin, or fentanyl, or whatever the right drug analogy is, and then they become a caricature of themselves. One of the reasons that I don't want to be sort of a one-man band is because I don't want to be cancel culture girl. Like, I don't want to be doing the same story every single day that I know will do really, really well with my audience. And so that's like expressly the reason why I want to build a team of people that all have their own voices and serve as a kind of like Avenger group when we're all together. And the second thing I'm doing, and we were all talking about this a bit backstage, is explicitly hiring people that are different from me, that have different views. And that the first question I ask in every single interview is, are you comfortable working in an organization with people that vote differently from you? And if the answer is in any way a hesitation, then it's not the right fit for my company.
Yeah. Chris, I want to bring you into this talking about trust because, 2017, when you were starting, you had to bring in some, I would say, pretty big names like Matt Taibbi. Like, there were some people who really joined early on and sort of created, I would say, a culture of trust at Substack. How did you think of doing that, and how has it evolved over the last 5 years?
We were very sort of idealistic in some of those early conversations. We had a good idea of what we wanted to build and why, and we were able to recruit people to the platform who we frankly had no business talking to or being able to bring on because they sort of felt the same problems that we did and could see a glimpse of the same future that we did. I mean, we had these ideas, we were confronting a lot of these same things, but we tended to look at it from kind of like a systems perspective, a network perspective. These changes that are happening are not going away. We're not gonna not have people able to directly connect with a large audience. That's a change in the world that you don't put the genie back in that bottle. We're not gonna go to a world where new people can't start their own media empire, start their own channel, start their own thing and reach out to the world. You're gonna have the ability for anybody to come into this thing. And we are sort of sitting there thinking, given that this game is going to exist, how can you set it up so that it has the best possible chances of pulling towards something good? Because every network, every system like this has a set of rules. It has a way that you win, a way that you make money, a way that you get famous, a way that you have an impact. And if the pull of that, you can never have a perfect pull. Somebody's always paying your paycheck. You're always getting people to pay attention to you somehow. There's no perfect, but there is better and worse, right? There is, if the thing that I'm doing is sort of maximally insane, that's how I win. I think we're closer to that in a lot of social media than we ought to be in what is possible. Yeah. And Substack is an attempt to push in the other direction. It's an attempt to say, hey, the way that you win is by earning and keeping the trust of people who deeply value what you do to the point where they might want to pay you. And that resonated with a lot of, frankly, the best writers and thinkers who had become disillusioned or even cast out of traditional media.
Yeah. Jim, I want to understand how this new media environment has affected lawmakers, politicians. Is the op-ed still important? Is the press conference still important? Or is it seen as almost, going back to the trust question, you're not trustworthy if you're standing by a podium. You have to go direct like AOC does on a live stream.
Technology, social platforms have radically changed politics like they've radically changed everything else. And, at the same time, there's things that happened in politics that made that possible, right? Like the minute that you just step back and think about 15 years ago, the minute you got rid of soft money, the minute that you started to make it hard for people to have the benefit of appropriations, right? Being able to give away money, pork money. People hated it, but it gave individuals power and it gave leadership power. You basically created an environment where leadership here became irrelevant. Whereas when I started covering this stuff, it mattered. You wanted the blessing of the Speaker of the House and the majority leader. They could give you a good committee. They could come campaign for you. They could allow you to get the right project directed to your district. Now, you don't want to be anywhere near your leader, usually. You sure as hell don't need their money, and you don't give a crap what committee you're on. And you've been replaced by, if you think about the politicians that most of us can name in this room outside of the leaders, they're all famous, right? And they're not famous for good reasons. It's not like these are like the best and the brightest, and you're like, awesome, man, I want to get edified by what you have to say. It's usually people who are kind of jackass performers, right, on social media. And they figured that out, right? And that's really corrupted politics, and it's made it harder to get things to work. Like government is an extremely complex institution. It's really hard to bring a collective group of people together to get any kind of solution done. You throw in these new dimensions, and it adds a sort of sugary dimension to what should be a really serious thing. And I don't see that changing. And now, because of that performative dimension, it gets harder and harder to get the people that you know in your life that you think should run for office, that you want to run for office, that you pray run for office. No sane person would do that, right? So you get what you got.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. We've been talking a lot about sort of national news, sort of, politics as performance. Like these are things that I think audiences very much crave. They see it as entertainment in some ways. But local news is something that I think a lot of people have been worried about, not necessarily figured out. We're coming off elections where we're still counting votes, and there aren't necessarily journalists on the ground who are familiar with a lot of these counties that are important. Like, how do we fix local news? Is that a priority for you? I know Substack, there's independent journalists who are thinking about local, but how do we fix sort of the rest of the country, not just Washington?
That's a Jim question because of what Axios is doing with local. I'll just say quickly, and this is, I don't need to blow smoke up Chris's ass. I love Substack, I'm on it. But the kind of local news that I'm seeing out of specifically like San Francisco and the Bay Area on Substack has been mind-blowing. Like if you look at what Michael Schellenberger is doing on the issues of crime, public policy, and homelessness in the Bay Area and in San Francisco specifically, he's eating the mainstream press's lunch. Yeah. Leighton Woodhouse being another example of that. And frankly, just looking at sort of the revival, as I see it, of the San Francisco Chronicle, maybe things just have to get like really, really bad for people to be able to pay for local news. But Jim's just doing so much in that area.
It's hard. It's the single hardest thing in journalism to fix and to make right. And I'm not gleeful about it. I think most newspapers that exist today won't exist in 5 years. You can't. The distribution model doesn't work. The big building model doesn't work. And just sort of the culture that made them great just doesn't work today. And so I think the solution of local journalism is much closer to us in Substack than it is to any big institution. And what we've done is we're in 25 cities, hopefully we'll soon be in 50 and then more, where we're going and trying to hire the 2 best reporters, create a daily newsletter, create a daily habit. As we bring in revenue, start to grow the size of the staff as you have the revenue, so you don't collapse yourself with a heavy investment that makes you feel good but is not sustainable. And having spent 20 years like trying to engineer these media companies based on the known knowns, it's the only model I can imagine that could work today. And it still might not work. We have not 100% validated. It's a hell of a big bet. It's one of the reasons that Cox bought us. They believe in it, but it's a hell of a big bet. And what it takes are some of these individual contributors who can do great news, probably having to come into a place like Axios together, because I do think you need the trappings of an editor and collaboration to do great journalism at scale over time. But that's a big one. There's just a lot of, it's not just that there aren't newspapers in a lot of these cities. The smaller you get, the political parties are getting clever. They make up things that will just say like the Oshkosh Times or something like that are make-believe, and they manipulate it. Then they use Facebook and the platforms to put it in front of people. People think, oh, all content's created equal. It's real.
The political parties make things up?
Every once in a while. They even make up publications.
Yeah.
So it's a hard one. I hope that between all of us here, we solve it. And again, like I can't stress how hard media companies are to run because the margin for error is so thin. You have to be able to get your editorial, your business, your marketing, your distribution, your technology to somehow magically work in synchronicity and pray that the market doesn't go to hell while you're doing it. Yeah. And if you can do that, you can create successful models. And that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about what you guys are up to, because I do think like I'm constantly trying to see, are there ways to empower, to locate, to unleash these individual talents that maybe we're missing when we're sitting here in Washington, because it's one of the hardest things about the job is finding really talented people who are fearless, who are curious, who can deliver the goods. Once you have that, then the models get a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to end with a question for all of you, because you all were right 6 years ago when the majority of investors, the majority of news pundits were wrong about what was happening with new media. 5, 10 years from now, Bari, you said this, like you're liking the direction that it's going in. What does media landscape look like, and where are you placing your bets? Let's start with Bari.
I mean, to me, the thing that I'm running up against is like the oldest thing, maybe in any industry, but definitely in journalism, which is like you need good, curious people that are genuinely open-minded and empathetic, that are willing to get on planes, trains, and walk and get information about the world. Mm-hmm. Like in a way that, as much as the model has changed and the mechanism for distributing it has changed, like that remains a thing that is needed. And so I find myself doing exactly what people probably 50 years would do, although maybe I'm looking in a really different place. Maybe I'm looking on a random Substack with 100 followers for this person, as opposed to a local paper. But I am still looking for like cub reporters that can be trained by seasoned editors into how to do great journalism. Yeah. And so I just really believe that readers are smart, listeners are smart. They can see through the bullshit. And the model that, whatever the distribution channel is, or whether it's subscription or advertising, the people that respect their readers and listeners enough to tell them the truth about the world as it actually is, and not as a projection or a fantasy of some narrative, that is a winning formula as far as I'm concerned. And that's what I'm betting on.
Chris, where do you think it's headed?
I 100% agree with the idea that talented people that want to seek the truth and that care are the secret to making a media that helps us understand ourselves and our society. And I think the games that you set up, the incentives that exist in the places that they see themselves where they can go. Talented people want to have an impact. They want to go somewhere where they can make a difference, where they can do work they actually believe in. And what are going to be the dominant forms of media, right? The elephant in the room is TikTok. It's like this Chinese-run slot machine game thing. And the type of people that are attracted to making that thing are not necessarily the ones that are going to make for the strongest democracy, right? The existing media institutions have a lot going for them, but I don't know that if you're a smart, talented person, that's the place that gives you the chills in your spine that you're going to be able to do something great. And so I think if we can create universes, create worlds online where you can do work you believe in, have an impact, get read, make money, actually have a business model that lets you do things that matter. I think if we can create that, it'll make for a much better future.
And Jim, where are we headed?
I think I believe what I'm going to say. I think most local television stations that you watch today are dead. Most newspapers that exist today in cities and towns, either dead or a tiny shell of them former selves. Cable TV, I think most of the people who are watching it right now will be dead, and then therefore I think that I don't see my generation alive. So then what replaces what going to TV? So then what replaces that is what the trend that I like is you see more and more journalists becoming entrepreneurs, and I see more and more media companies starting with actual business models as opposed to pipe dreams. And so what I think will survive will be anybody who can create a relationship of trust, create authentic value, not kind of BS click stuff that you sort of get because Facebook or somebody else is going to reward you with some kind of traffic that you can monetize in an ephemeral nature. And I think it'll be a much better place. I think there'll be a higher quality of information. And I think the big test will be, like, do we end up, one of the things I fear is like information inequality. Mm-hmm. Like right now, for me personally, and probably everyone maybe in this room, certainly on this stage, I find it to be information nirvana. There's more good information than ever before. I know how to filter out the bullshit. I know how to figure out who's really smart. I know how to follow them on Substack or Axios or the Times. I read it. I feel like my mind is richer as a result of it. I think more and more people are going to discover that. What I worry about is like the rest of the people who don't take advantage of that. Like, does it end up only exacerbating income inequality and other forms of inequality because of the information inequality? But I think it's going to be much closer to information nirvana for most of us 10 years from now than it is today.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think we all look forward to information nirvana and sort of where we're headed. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.